everyone, and welcome back to Crime Bee Conversations. I'm your host, Rafaella Lispschitz, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Henry Ziemer. Henry is an associate fellow at the Americas program at CSIS, where he focuses on organized crime, geopolitical competition, and emerging technologies in the Americas. And in a recent piece, Henry explored the way we measure the sizes of illicit economies and the problems that often come up with that. And with US counter-narcotics policy shifting towards a more militarized fashion, the claims behind the achievements of those policies are getting bigger, but the measurement problem remains the same. So today with Henry, we're going to be talking about some of these issues, how analysts try to estimate the size of illicit economies, why sometimes things like seizure information can be misleading rather than informative, and what better metrics might actually look like. Thanks so much for joining me, Henry.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Great, thank you. So I just want to start with a sort of broad and general understanding of the issue we're talking about here. When we're trying to look at interdiction success, we generally look at two numbers. One is the amount we're catching, and the second is the amount that's actually out there. How do analysts and experts and governments typically try to get at that second number, and how trusting should we be at any estimates we see?
Yeah. I think the first thing I'll say is it depends tremendously on what you're looking at. So the example of cocaine, I think, is actually, and plant-based drugs broadly, are one of the easier things to get at that, denominator, I guess is what I would call it. Because in the case of cocaine, you can survey from the air, from satellite imagery even, the amount of hectares under cultivation in some of the key coca-producing countries. You can sort of calculate out the expected yield, run some, calculations for expected losses and to disease or weather or whatnot, and figure out basically how much cocaine is being produced. So UNODC pretty regularly produces estimates on both the number of hectares under cultivation and the estimated total amount of cocaine. And in 2023, it was about 3,700 tons. A pretty big amount of drugs that's being produced, or a large amount of drugs that's being produced. Then you can go backwards and you can sum up the seizure statistics and you can actually get a decent sense for how well we're doing in the fight against cocaine. Obviously, we don't have really the fidelity to tell always where exactly the cocaine's going from, what the total volumes, say going to the United States versus Europe or Africa or internal are. But with plant-based drugs, it's pretty good. With stuff like synthetic drugs, so fentanyl, methamphetamine, other chemically synthesized drugs, it's much harder. And even organizations like the UNODC basically don't report estimates or don't even try to estimate how much is totally out there. And then with other things, it varies tremendously on kind of the modality or the methods that the illicit economy is generated by. So illegal logging, closer to plant-based drugs. You can look from this, from outer space. Arms trafficking, more similar to, I'd say, synthetic drugs. It's really hard to get a good sense. It's really hard to find a good estimate about how many guns are flowing across borders everywhere. So it depends a lot on what you're trying to estimate.
Great, thank you. And with, in the headlines and nowadays we're seeing so many articles and things about record seizures, record drug busts, whether it's often cocaine, sometimes synthetic substances, or record number of arrests. How should we read into those? Is that indicative of us doing a better job? Is that indicative of there being a better market? What do those sorts of articles and headlines tell us?
Yeah, I think the simple thing is not a whole lot. And I write this a little in my piece. I say, even Venezuela will report record drug busts and record seizures and record arrests. It's not necessarily emblematic or indicative of your state capacity just to set a record for something. And in my opinion, drilling down a little bit more, right? Record seizures or large drug busts are probably, it's better in a vacuum to have those than to not have those. But we should be really focused on what our real metrics of success are. Because if your metric of success is maximizing the amount of drugs that's seized, that's a bad objective. Because actually you're incentivized to have more drugs being produced so that you can seize more of them. Really what your measures of success should be, in my opinion, are looking at levels of violence, how how is the state of organized criminal violence in your country? And if you're talking about drugs, overdose deaths, right? If overdose deaths are declining, regardless of what you're doing, presumably a confluence of policies is contributing to that decline. And that's what we should be really focused on. We shouldn't be myopically oriented around maximizing these headline-catching busts, but instead should be thinking about, how can we tell that the situation with organized crime and illicit economies in our country is getting better or worse, as the case may be.
Great, thank you. And just going back to, you bring up the UNODC and trying to measure the total size of markets and things like that. We often see in various policy reports or data sets or articles these numbers or these citations of how big an illicit economy is, whether that's drugs, whether it's more specific cocaine, something synthetic, whatever it is. How often when you dig into that sourcing, do you find that these methodologies hold up and that they are up to date?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should start by saying I think that everyone who's in this space is coming to it from a good faith standpoint, and that often the problem is almost not necessarily in the methodologies that people are using, but rather in how they're presented in the public eye. Because when you put out a number, people report on the number. They don't report on the methods behind it or the confidence intervals that you may have put in your analysis. They just say, oh, X many millions of dollars are in the illicit system, says so-and-so organization. And we, of course, experience this at CSIS. I think it's, goes without saying that that's sort of a risk you run when you're doing any type of public policy analysis. But, to actually answer your question, often the numbers that we're relying on are several years, if not more, decades out of date. One of the best reports that's often used by people in my space to estimate the value of illicit economies is Global Financial Integrity's report on illicit economies in the developing world. The last report that they put out on that was in 2017. And even if you look at that report for, for their data on the size of the drug market, what they basically do is they use two methodologies, but one of those methodologies, they look at UNODC statistics for cocaine, amphetamines, opioids, cannabis from 2009 to, in the case of cannabis, it's in 2003. And they look at what the UNODC estimated was the production, the value, and then they calculate based on inflation how much that value would be that in 2017. So you're backfilling with data that's several years old, and you're extrapolating out with global inflation numbers. But as we all know, cocaine prices just alone fluctuate tremendously depending on local circumstances, depending on government interventions. We've seen even more recently a real spike in cocaine cultivation, especially in Colombia. So there's a lot of factors that mean that kind of extrapolation from 2009 data is, I would say, fairly unreliable, and it's hard to get at it. Now, that may mean that UNODC, right, of the factors I'm describing, that UNODC or Global Financial Integrity's estimates are an undercount, but it's still valuable to know that we're undercounting by a pretty big amount when it comes to that. And the other example I'll give that I looked into was the case of arms trafficking. And arms trafficking, I mentioned before, is sort of notoriously hard to really get a good handle on, get a good estimate for. A lot of our estimates are based on this estimate from the Small Arms Survey that the illicit arms market is about 10 to 20% of the illicit arms market. So the total size of the small arms, light weapons market, about 10 to 20% of that. And that's really convenient because you can look at the global arms market and just calculate out from that in a given year. But when I looked into it, at least, I traced that all the way back to a report from Small Arms Survey in 2001. And to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen that methodology, and I haven't seen it really updated for today. So we could be making policy, I would say, based on quarter of a century old data or estimates in some cases.
Wow, that's very useful to know. Thank you. And I think important that we think about that when we are making these policies and analyses and things like that. Henry, I want to turn now to the Trump administration's airstrike campaign in the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean. I think this is a good example of where numbers and measurements might be a little bit murky. The Trump admin has claimed that this airstrike campaign has reduced seaborne trafficking by over 90%. When we see an administration make such big claims about the successes of a particular policy, what sort of questions should we be asking before we reject or accept it?
Yeah, so I would say I tend to be biased towards treating government statistics a little bit more credulously than I might open source statistics, because presumably the government has access to more confidential, non-public sources and methods that allow them to estimate something, with a higher degree of confidence than me being an open source analyst would. At the same time, when you see a claim like 97, 98% of seaborne drug trafficking, we've seen that decline, you should ask yourself a number of questions. And I think the first question would be, what are the seizure data telling us? And Adam Isaacson over at the Washington Office on Latin America has done a pretty good job of continuing to report what Customs and Border Protection say, report the number of drugs that they're seizing at the border each year. And in particular, the amount of cocaine is pretty much unchanged. So if you look at, if you assume that the percentage of cocaine that we seize at the border every year or every month is a relatively stable percentage, right? Let's say like we seize 20% of all inbound cocaine, just baseline. If the total amount of inbound cocaine is declined by 98%, you'd expect to see the volume, the weight of coke that we're seizing similarly decline precipitously, because our methods at the border haven't necessarily changed, but there's just less coming in. We see this. We've actually seen this, in the case of with fentanyl, where when overdoses declined, we similarly saw less cocaine being interdicted at the border because there's less cocaine moving into the U.S. market. So in contrast to that, we haven't seen the amount of cocaine seized at the border decline. Suggests to me that there's still, it's still coming in. The second thing we can look at actually is PolitiFact did ask the White House about their data on this, and they were directed to some data from CBP showing that between July and November of 2025, there was actually a 98% decrease in the amount of drugs seized in sea and air operations. Now, there's a few qualifiers to that, if that's the data that the White House is relying on to make these assertions. Number one is the fact that the Coast Guard, not CBP, is typically in charge of air and maritime interdiction, sort of outside, beyond the U.S. border, in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, where these boats are transiting through. And Coast Guard actually reported record amounts of cocaine seizures in fiscal year 2025. Additionally, if you actually look at that data, there's a spike in July. July, there's a record amount of especially cannabis seized in CBP air and maritime operations. Excuse me. There's a record amount seized in July in air and maritime operations, and then it kind of reverts back to the baseline by November. So the percentage change is a lot bigger than you might expect when you actually parse that data. And then the final thing, and I would say is this is actually drawn from General Francis Donovan, the commander of U.S. Southern Command. His testimony on the Hill a couple weeks ago, where he said that we're looking at boat launches, and that boat launches have declined dramatically, actually. And that's where I would say, the government has access to data that we don't. They have intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance tools that we wouldn't, to actually see where these boats are launching from. And that could potentially be the case, that we're seeing fewer boats being launched, these go-fast boats, cigarette boats, towards the United States. Maybe we've seen, a 90% decrease in those, but that clearly, the data I've just presented, that clearly doesn't mean that cocaine flows are necessarily declining by that amount, because we're still seizing basically unchanged levels at the border. So, even if boat launches are down, maybe drug traffickers have pivoted to other routes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That leads me into my next question, which is about that, the sort of displacement issue, in that we see boat seaborne trafficking go down if we do accept that claim, even at 90%. But as you said, cocaine is still reaching the US. So that could be, as you said, shifting to maybe air methods, other sort of maritime methods, overland methods. How do we, when looking at the data and trying to measure the success of an interdiction policy, how do we account for displacement or the idea that traffickers might just be shifting to other methods?
Yeah, I always say drug trafficking organizations are nothing if not adaptable. And even at the beginning, when the United States started this lethal air campaign, which was a real step change in how we dealt with seaborne drug trafficking, the networks that are behind this, the organizations that are behind this, aren't going to throw up their hands and say, "Oh, guess we're not able to traffic drugs anymore." They're going to always be looking for new routes, for new and unguarded opportunities to keep moving their product and keep their financial flows going. And so we've seen anecdotal evidence, including, actually during General Donovan's testimony before Congress, that traffickers are shifting to prioritize air routes, shifting also to another method that we've always known, which is adulterating cargoes, legitimate cargoes, with cocaine or other drugs. So hiding it in various, secret compartments in cargo shipments and trying to get that across. And then I think, in my opinion, the most interesting new development, which is the emergence of uncrewed underwater vehicles. We saw in July the first instance of a narco submarine that was built with a Starlink terminal designed to be remotely piloted that was seized in Colombia. We just saw a seizure off the coast of Spain of a uncrewed underwater vehicle, similarly rigged with a sort of a satellite terminal connection, allowing it to be remotely piloted. I think that makes a lot of sense. If I'm a drug trafficking organization, you expose fewer risk. You also pay less overhead on your, the crews that are required to move this product. So again, they're incredibly adaptable, and it's often been likened to squeezing a balloon. When you clamp down on drug trafficking in one area, it pops up in another. And that, I think, the one thing I'll just say to all of that is that, the data that we have on how these routes are shifting is really, in my opinion, like the holy grail of data on organized crime. Because I talked to you about how we have actually really good data on how much cocaine is out there. We have pretty good data on how much cocaine we're seizing at the border, but we don't actually know, how much is flowing through Brazil, how much is flowing through Colombia, how much is flowing through Ecuador, Guyana, Venezuela, all these other countries in real time with that level of, fidelity that allows us to say, oh, trafficking is going down here and it's rising here. That indicates, a shift. I think that, the U.S. Southern Command and other agencies are much far ahead of it from me. But that remains, in my opinion, the last step that we need to actually really fine tune our interdiction.
Thank you, Henry. That's great. And you mentioned this a bit earlier, but I'm wondering if we can dig into it more, just sort of looking forward. If seizure data, for example, is not always the most accurate measure of how big something is, what other sort of maybe low-hanging metrics, low-hanging fruit, could we be using to more accurately gauge the size of these economies? And also, like you said, with the cocaine, for example, where it's going and where it's leaving from?
Yeah. So, in my opinion, really the low-hanging fruit that you should be asking about is, what are the outcomes we want? What do we want for our societies? And I tend to be a big fan of homicide and crime data. I think, at a basic level, if your homicide rate is increasing, things are probably getting worse. If it's decreasing, things are probably getting better. And obviously there's large problems with how countries report homicide rates. I'm not suggesting that's some, perfect metric, but I think looking at the level of violence in a society is a better proxy for the kinds of outcomes we're interested in. Because obviously we do want to crack down on drug trafficking and illicit economies, but really at the end of the day, what I'm interested in the Americas is a more peaceful, stable, and prosperous hemisphere. And from that metric, I think it's a relatively good proxy for how powerful, how strong, how violent, and how how able to oppose the state organized crime groups are, is looking at, how much violence that they are inflicting on a society. And if we can bring that down, that's probably, a good indicator. The other indicator I mentioned before, and this is maybe in drug markets, drug consumer countries, is overdose deaths, right? Your main focus should be on ensuring that your people are not dying of illicit or contaminated drugs. And obviously there's a robust debate over supply side or demand side interventions. I fall somewhere in the middle. I think that supply reduction is important. I think demand reduction is also important. That could take another whole conversation talking about this. But I would say, that you can unite both camps in the cause of, let's reduce the overdoses that we're seeing. Let's improve the public health outcomes. So, these aren't particularly good measures of an illicit economy size, but they are, I think, good proxies for all the things that we want to be seeing in our society, which is being safer and healthier, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And focusing on the outcomes, as you say, I think that's definitely a good place to start. And Henry, my last question for you, just looking again at the data and how we measure these sorts of things, do you see any other methodologies or any other ways of measuring this in different fields, whether that's like epidemiology, people look at a lot, or wildlife biology, that you think we could take and we could apply to measuring illicit markets that might help us better gauge the size of these different things?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And I'll give a shout out to a good example of a recent study by Topher McDougall and Sean Campbell, who tried to capture, the size of the illicit arms market or the illicit arms flow from the United States to Mexico, which I mentioned before is very hard to do, very tricky. Data sources are pretty poor, especially publicly available ones. But they use a capture-recapture method. So, right, one of the ways that you can estimate the population of animals in the wild, where it's not actually, you can't actually round up every single animal with any degree of confidence that you've rounded all of them up, is you take a sample, you tag them, you release them, and then you take a separate sample independently at a later point, and you see how many of the individuals that you tagged originally are in that second sample. If it's a lot of them, you have pretty good confidence that you actually probably got close to the total population with your first sample. If it's like one, you're pretty sure that the real population is much bigger. And so they use this really interesting methodology with two different data sets of arms seized by Mexican federal authorities. One by sort of all federal authorities, and one just by the Secretariat of National Defense. And it's interesting. It's obviously not two independent samples. They're not tagging the guns and re-releasing them. But I thought it was a real interesting method to try and apply, basically saying that, we can assume that the proportion of one of these samples, the smaller of the two, in the larger one, is the same as the proportion of, the total guns seized to the total population of illicit guns in Mexico. I'm doing a pretty bad job of describing this.
No, I'm understanding, yeah.
But I would say that, that's an interesting, I read that and I thought, this is a really cool method for trying to get at this, obviously, unknowable total population. And it has major problems, including with data quality, including with the fact, of course, that these are not two sequential independent samples. But nevertheless, I would like to advocate always for, people producing more stuff with more of their kind of hearts laid bare in terms of methodology. I think that we all benefit from a more robust discussion about the ways that people are calculating these things and the ways that, and being open about the limitations to that. I think it's much better than the conversation that I often hear, which is things like, the Mexican government estimates that 500,000 guns get trafficked into Mexico from the United States each year, where they wrote that down based on an estimate, and we have no idea. There's no way of calculating that. But of course, it gets repeated everywhere because it's the Mexican government's estimate. I would much prefer, a culture where we are open about the challenges to estimating illicit economies and can have more of a conversation about the methodological limitations to getting at those.
Absolutely. Well, Henry, thank you so much. This has been really informative and a great conversation. And thank you all for tuning into this episode. Henry's article where he speaks about this in depth will be linked below, and please stay tuned for more. Thanks.